So next up, I am delighted to welcome Harini Kulatunga. Harini is the former head of solutions and head of UK for Airbus Urban Mobility. In her role at Airbus, Harini steered the development of urban air mobility customer solutions to meet market requirements. Harini has a strong scientific research background and previously worked as Chief Technology Officer at BP. Harini, I'm so pleased you could join us today. Once again, please do send in your questions for Harini and indeed our other online EV Summit EY guests via the Q&A tab. Harini, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Abe. Just a small correction. I wasn't the Chief Technology Officer of BP. I was working in his team during my time in BP. So the future of aviation is driven in several key areas, and the most exciting and game-changing for the industry is in urban mobility. Urban mobility can encompass potentially profitably sub-regional travel from city to city, but most understand it to be a service to provide time savings in congested metropolitan areas or airport to city center travel. The vehicles that will enable this travel range from 2% to 15% electric aircrafts, or more popularly known as air taxis, or drones even. The speed of technology development has demanded the change of approach from every area of aviation, and that goes beyond design, certification, and regulation to policy, safety, public acceptance, infrastructure, construction, and not to mention on-demand booking services to the consumer. This has also demanded rapid development of new skills in understanding and developing these complex systems. While in the last year itself, we have seen about $4.3 billion raised in investments for air taxis, the most challenging hurdles are with certification and regulation associated with building these vehicles and integrating them into the airspace. Apart from the technical challenges, there's also the noise and public acceptance of these technologies. And cities need to play a key role in introducing these technologies, similar to electric vehicles, as the responsibility of licensing operators, permitting routes, determining infrastructure locations will all be up to national and local authorities. Therefore, an UAM or unmanned air mobility requires an ecosystem approach to ensure that all the stakeholders involved in bringing about a commercial service are collaborating and working together at an early stage of introducing this new technology and setting standards for operations in the future. So the UAM ecosystem encompasses the vehicle, as we always hear on the media, and it's the exciting part of this, but also unmanned traffic management, infrastructure, the operator, and the services that needs to make this happen. So several areas to consider in commercializing these air taxis, who could be the precursor to trialing new electric vehicles, aviation vehicles, are profitability, infrastructure in cities, and certification and investment. So there has been a question on how profitable is it to develop these services in cities. So there are several commercial enterprises that had operated using spare capacity of helicopters to prove the demand models that could potentially be satisfied by air taxis in the future. For example, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, there had been air taxi services operated using helicopters. Therefore, it's especially interesting in recent years to look at the deals that Avalon has done with GOL using the UK's own air taxi company, Vertical Aerospace. Now, they predict a cost of $1 for one person to travel 25 miles. And when they launch a commercial service to offer a ride at the same cost as an Uber. Now, cities similar to Sao Paulo are Tokyo, Delhi, Seoul, and Shanghai. So the emerging UAM commercial services in Asia Pacific regions and in India will be interesting to watch due to the predicted similarities with Sao Paulo and the potential profitability of these services when they start launching around mid of this decade. Embraer, for example, one of the more traditional aerospace companies, has agreed to provide about 100 vehicles to an operator in Asia Pacific region called Ascent to fly in 2026. So the second puzzle in the UAM ecosystem is infrastructure and the cities. This is quite a complex challenge because of the multiple stakeholders that need to come together from commercial, regulatory, and construction sectors. And the cities need to understand quite a complex puzzle in certification. Even though they're set by the authorities, the cities still need to understand certain requirements. They need to understand infrastructure positioning when it comes to vertipads and vertiports, noise pollution and public acceptance, and finally construction laws and how to build new laws and implement them. So they need to think about how to integrate these new vehicles into existing city infrastructure. And the priority for cities will be very different from the priorities for aviation. So the cities, the priorities would be to maximize equity and accessibility for everyone, or as many as possible, on top of increasing commercial activity in those cities. And therefore, they need to consider the entire transportation network and optimize traffic flow and understand the impact of introducing these urban air routes in the sky, as well as how to gain public acceptance through services such as emergency services gaining priority over other services for air taxis. And many cities have launched certain initiatives, such as Los Angeles, to work with all these multiple stakeholders to understand how to form policy and new laws and zoning rules to enable planning, route identification, location identification for these new services to be introduced sooner rather than later. And OEMs such as Archer, Hyundai, Volocopter, and Joby are working quite closely with these city-based initiatives to support cities to introduce these services. So the ecosystem approach is quite important in order to bring this electric aviation vehicle into service and to use. And there's one area where it does overlap with EVs, and that's in infrastructure and charging. There is a lot that the aviation industry would adopt from sustainable energy sources as developed from the automotive sector, as Steve Wright mentioned. But there is additional complexities to adapt it to aviation and provide profitability, because the number of vehicles that would be flying might be much less than number of automobiles on the road. Now, OEMs probably will not invest in real estate. Therefore, the high likelihood is that they will collaborate with cities to work on an open system when it comes to infrastructure. That is, the infrastructure that is built for landing and takeoff of these vehicles would have an open system that is open standards that are defined and shared between the OEMs. And this is a promising outlook, because that could help in further speeding up the introduction of this vehicle into cities if standardization can be achieved on the ground on how these vehicles operate. And there's still, of course, an open question of unmanned traffic management, whether that should be provided centrally, subsidized and as part of the infrastructure, or should UTM services be a separate commercial service provided by third parties, such as how communication companies provide services for mobile phones today. But of course, the role of UTM will be very different in terms of guaranteeing safe integration of these vehicles into urban skies, as well as in the future, maybe 10 years down the line, enabling autonomous flight. So the other jigsaw in the puzzle is certification. There are two main authorities when it comes to certification globally, and that's EASA and FAA. And EASA has certain certification frameworks published for early certification of some of the air taxis, and they foresee commercial services being introduced in mid of this decade, so 2024, 2025. And they predict the first vehicles to be certified vehicles to fly at that time would be Lilium and Volocopter. And each vehicle would take about 4 to 5 years to go through EASA certification process, and 5 more years on top of that for autonomous flight to be possible. And as I mentioned earlier, the investments in this sector seems to be speeding up. I'm not sure whether it's the impact of the pandemic, but there has been a record investment in this area in the last year. And there's been 83% rise in investment over the last 5 years. If we look at purely at investments, Joby Aviation has been the most successful, which also incorporated Uber's previous flying taxi business. But when we look at orders, it's slightly different. In terms of orders, by Aerospace, much more lesser known, has about 250 million in orders placed. Beta Technologies has an order of up to 150 vehicles placed by UPS, and Vertical, a UK-based company, has orders of over 1,000 vehicles. So there is a slight difference in the way investments are going as with respect to orders. So this is an exciting area, and Airbus, for example, considers going forward their strategy that these vehicles will be the test bed or prototype for them to look at how electric flying vehicles, the large electric flying vehicles, could be developed. But as Steve mentioned earlier, it's a challenge, and I agree with him that it's very hard to see a transatlantic electric jet flying till 2050.
Harini, thank you very, very much indeed for those super insightful remarks. We're running a little over time, so we've only got time for one question, I'm afraid, but it's a really interesting one from Richard Helen, who asks, would it be easier to trial sustainable aerospace infrastructure needs in a rural or semi-rural context where barriers to adoption might be lower, even if this is not as commercially a viable option as a pure urban setting? What are your thoughts on that?
There is currently many trials happening in rural settings, especially for drones, not for air taxis. And I suspect that the initial trials will be in rural areas before it gets translated to urban areas. The certification process for vehicles require a certain number of flight hours before a vehicle is certified. So I suspect that there will be trials happening today in rural areas to enable this to happen. And the first commercial flights that are introduced will probably be on predefined routes. And those predefined routes might be over unpopulated areas. So for example, disused railway tracks, or over forests, or areas which in case of accident does not impact on urban population. So she's right, most probably the first routes will be in remote areas, but ultimately the profitable routes will probably be in urban areas for these vehicles, especially the 2-seaters to 4-seater vehicles.